Okay. Yeah, so yeah, this is a little bit a different order than I typically do it, but that's okay. I kind of all can go this way as well. I changed the order around a little bit based on not wanting to have the TBL day right when we got back. But so today we'll do the spinal cord. Wednesday will be the brain. So different regions of the brain is really what it is. Not a lot of physiology there, but it's mostly kind of knowing the regions and then kind of general functions of what they do. And then we'll get into the cranial nerves next week. So yeah, we're actually going to start out with a clicker question here. So go ahead and yeah, talk about that for a sec. Take a guess here. And yeah. All right, anybody else? Go ahead and send something in there. Nice and evenly split across A through D, it looks like about a quarter on each. That's fine. Just a guess here. But yeah, there we go. We got about everybody. So yeah, the spinal cord itself has about 1 billion. Okay. The total central nervous system has about 100 billion. So the vast majority of those are in the brain, not the spinal cord, right? But the spinal cord has quite a few itself. Okay. All right. Well, let's just briefly watch a look, and then yeah, we're going to dive into some of the details here next. So yeah, hold on one sec. Let me get that to work right. Okay. All right. Yeah. So we're really going to look at kind of the overview of the anatomy here. So we've kind of already gotten into this some with when we talked about spinal nerves, which region of the spinal cord certain types of neurons come from, right? With the whole SAD Dave thing. But this looks at it in a little bit different way. So looking at what's called the cross-sectional anatomy of the spinal cord, right? Like, so if you just chop it and you look straight down on it, kind of what's going on there cross-sectionally. Okay, so there's a couple sulci, which just means little indentations, right? So there's the ventral median sulcus, the dorsal median sulcus. That's just kind of this infolded part of the spinal cord on either side. Okay, and then when we look at the gray matter, so the gray matter is the gray matter is the somas of the neurons, right? So these are the cell bodies. Okay, so when you see this gray type material, that's cell bodies of neurons. When we see white matter, that's going to be axons, right? Because of the myelination is made out of lipids, which lipids tend to be white, right? So we see the gray matter there in the middle, and then it's all white matter here on the outside. And so we'll talk about all of these different regions and kind of which neurons are kind of tend to be found in each of these. Okay, yeah, so the cell bodies as well as synapses as well, right? Because when we have those other axons coming and interacting with the cell bodies, then that's where synapses are occurring. Give you a sec to finish writing that down. And so each of these little regions, as you can see here, have different names, right? So the posterior horn, the anterior horn, the lateral horns here, and all of those contain different groups of neurons. Okay, so we'll look at each of those individually here. All right, so the dorsal horn first. Okay, this is receiving afferent information and then sends it upwards to the brain. Okay, this aligns with what we already talked about. We've got this little structure over here that I just circled. What's that one called? Just remember, part of the spinal nerve stuff. This guy right here. Gotta know it for Friday too. The dorsal root ganglion, right? That's the dorsal root ganglion. That's the dorsal root, right? This is the ventral root, right? And then we have those rami, right? The the ventral ramus, dorsal ramus, right? But we know that those sensory neurons are going this direction, right? Now we're seeing where they're sending their signal to, right? They're sending their signal into this dorsal horn, right? And then that dorsal horn would send it upwards up into the brain to go be dealt with in the brain. And we'll talk about which part of the brain specializes in dealing with sensory information on Friday or on Wednesday with the TBL day. Okay, so that's the dorsal horn. All right, so that's all afferent information passing through the dorsal horn. Okay, then we got the ventral horn, this little tip out here. Any guesses on what kind of information would be found there? This is efferent, right? So this is our somatic motor neurons. Right, so now this information is going the other way, right? It's coming from the brain going down through this area. Okay, so this signal is going to start in the primary motor cortex, which we haven't talked about yet, but that'll be part of what you look at for the TBL stuff on Wednesday. That's part of your frontal lobe in your brain. And then there's going to be a primary motor neuron there that's going to send a signal down to the spinal cord. It's going to interact with a secondary motor neuron that's found right here, right? And those cell bodies of those secondary motor neurons are right there. And then they send their axons out the spinal nerve into a nerve like your ulnar nerve, your sciatic nerve, your femoral nerve, any of those nerves are going to go down and innervate skeletal muscle. Okay, and we can see how those tracks make their way down through. They're going to cross over in the spinal cord at some point, and then they're going to make their way out to skeletal muscle. Okay, so it's the ventral horn. Then we've got the lateral horn. It's really just these little tips right here. Okay, that's going to be cell bodies of autonomic neurons, primarily for the abdominal organs. Okay, so we don't really have this horn in all levels of the spinal cord, really just in the thoracic region where those abdominal organs are. We don't have a ventral horn typically in the cervical or in the lumbar region, really just there in the, like it says, from T1 to L2. Okay, so this is autonomic neurons. So this is primarily sympathetic and parasympathetic type neurons. Okay, so that's all the gray matter there in the middle. I'll give you another sec to finish writing that down. Okay, good. Looks like mostly everybody's got it there. Okay, so that's our gray matter. Then we're going to move on to the white matter. Okay, so white matter is going to be myelinated axons, like I said. So it's all of this stuff on the outside around that gray matter, those myelinated axons. Okay, and you can imagine that it's going to be very similar to the region where the somas are, right? You got the cell bodies right there. If it's sensory information right here, then it's going to be sensory information in those axons being sent out. All the motor information in here, it's going to be motor axons going that direction as well, right? So that white matter is all efferent. Up above the white matter is all afferent. Okay. All right, we'll take a quick sec and just recap this briefly with the people on your team. We'll come back together here in a sec. All right, well, let's go ahead and come back together here. It's like most of you have filled that in. So gray matter, we're saying is what? What part of the neuron? The somas and what else? Cell bodies, which is the soma, but then it's those synapses, right? So it's where axons are interacting with either the dendrites or the cell bodies directly of those neurons. And then the white matter is the axons, which contain myelin. Okay, and then efferent's coming out of which side? Ventral. There we go. And then afferent, dorsal, and then autonomic, lateral. Good. Okay. All right. Questions on any of that basic setup of the spinal cord? Okay. And you'll notice, we'll talk about it in a second, but you'll notice there's a little hole in the middle here called the central canal. We'll get into what that is in a second, but that's just a nice picture of it there before we move on. Okay, so spinal cord, the true spinal cord extends from the foramen magnum, right? Coming out of your skull there down to L2. After that, we're going to call it something different. Okay, but that's the true spinal cord there in the middle. It's very tightly packed. It's just packed full of neurons, right? Okay, so there's a couple of special regions of it on top there called the cervical enlargement, right? You can see where it's thicker there. Lots and lots of extra neurons in that spot. Okay, one of the reasons for that is because in most places below the cervical region, the nerves can just exit out right away, right? But in the neck, they can't, right? They have to all travel downwards first until we get to the shoulder, then they can exit out, right? So by the time all the nerves that started at C1, C2, C3, those all have to be added to the spinal cord before they can exit, right? Whereas once we get into the thoracic and the lumbar, they can just exit right away. So that cervical part is very thick, okay? But there's also a lumbar enlargement too. We get lots of extra neurons passing and leaving the spinal cord after that, okay? And then there's a special region called the cauda equina, which isn't technically the spinal cord anymore. That means the horse's tail. So if you're familiar with what horses' tails look like, they're kind of like, yeah, kind of stringy, kind of spread out looking. There's some space between the big hair bunches, right? And that's really what that region looks like. You can kind of see how it looks like a little bit like that once you get down in the bottom part. And so it's not technically the spinal cord. There's a little bit more space in there, okay? And yeah, and so that's actually the region that most injections are done into the spinal cord, or the region that cerebral spinal fluid is taken out, because there's more space in there and it's much less likely to hit a nerve with a needle when you stick a needle in that region. Okay, so for example, there's a couple different things that can be done there, right? So there's what's called an epidural. Okay, and so an epidural, but then there's also a spinal tap too, and you can see the difference here. So this is an epidural needle happening here. Okay, you can kind of look at the different things going on. So there's the skin obviously out here. There's some connective tissue. There's some pretty dense ligaments in there. Okay, and then there's the muscle in this part, right? So all that vertebral muscle, all those spinal extensor muscles. Okay, and then you can see there that the dura mater is shown right here. That's this yellow one. The dura mater, we'll talk about those different maters here in a second, but those are different linings that help protect our central nervous system. Dura mater is the most exterior one. So when we have something called an epidural, that means it's outside of the dura mater, right? So you can see that needle is going in. It's passing through all those different structures we just talked about, through this big ligament too. There's some big ligaments that hold the vertebrae together. So passing through that, but then it should stop right there. And then that's where the medications that cause numbness are inserted, right? So if a woman gets an epidural during delivery, that's where they put the medication right in the cauda equina, goes down, it knocks out all sensation below that level, as well as motor function too, right? And so yeah, so that's the idea with that. But with a spinal tap, it's supposed to go through the dura mater and actually into the cerebral spinal fluid, so you can pull some of that fluid out analyze it for meningitis or whatever it might be that needs to be checked out. Okay. Quick story about this. During the our second kid, so when Christian was born, my wife was getting her epidural, and it's a tricky thing because most of the time, by the time you say, yeah, I'm going to get the epidural, you're already in full-on contractions. You're definitely in full-on contractions at that point. But the anesthesiologist comes in and you have to sit up and you have to round your back over like this. And they tell you to stand as still as possible, but there's a good chance you're going to get a contraction like while you're trying to be as still as possible, right? So you're in excruciating pain. So yeah, so she did that. She rounded her back over. And yeah, and the anesthesiologist has to know just by feel like how deep they are in your back, right? And so the big thing that they're looking for is when you go through that ligament, there's kind of this tough part you hit with that ligament, and then it kind of goes right past that, and then you have to stop right there, right? But with this one, with Christian, I could tell something went wrong because she was, curled her back over, like you said, kind of stuck it in. And then I just saw her leg like kick out like this, like right when he stuck it in, and he kind of like, the anesthesiologist kind of made like a sound that didn't sound normal. I was like, I wonder what that was. And then he was just like, okay, and then he was kind of fiddling with it for a while. Then he kind of just like left the room and came back in like 10 minutes later. And he's like, you guys are healthcare providers, aren't you? We're like, she's a nurse and I teach about this stuff. He's like, I only mess up on healthcare providers. And he went through, he was like the head anesthesiologist at Kaiser. He's done thousands of these, but every once in a while they go too far. But yeah, he went all the way through into this region and pricked one of her lumbar nerves that made her hit one of those motor nerves that made her muscles contract. And so then there was all this risk of if you lose some cerebral spinal fluid, you can get a spinal headache and stuff like that, which is always it's an excruciating thing that can, it's kind of this debilitating headache that can last for like a couple weeks. And so he was telling us all these risk factors, like as she's about to have a baby, it's the last thing you want is like to have an excruciating headache the last 2 weeks, but luckily didn't have any of those side effects. So she was really lucky, but yeah, that was an interesting one. So yeah, but it is pretty to think about like how precise you have to be with that needle and not go too far. It's pretty intense, but yeah, so that's the story there. But yeah, but the reason you do it down low here is because there's less neurons in there, right? So less dense. Yeah, less dense with neurons. So there's just more space, and you can see that lots more space there in the cauda equina. So less likely to actually damage something when you stick that needle in there. Okay, questions on any of that stuff? Okay, and one just word of advice for someday when some of you ladies decide to have a baby, don't let the societal pressures of like, don't get an epidural, be tough, like don't let that get to you. If you want to get an epidural, get an epidural. Don't worry about it. It's modern medicine. It's the most amazing thing ever. You can enjoy your delivery, not be in excruciating pain. There's so many women stress out about that so much and think they got to be tough. They got to just enjoy the modern medicine. It's an amazing thing. Yeah, Alexia.
Obviously, there's probably a lot of practice that goes into not like taking this part of like.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a good question. They definitely do procedures on cadavers throughout med school, definitely surgical procedures and things like that. And I don't know the specifics on that one, but I know definitely surgeries they practice on cadavers first. But yeah, I'm not sure if they do that with those, but I would guess they probably do. But yeah, it is always practicing medicine, right? So yeah, a lot of injections now can be done ultrasound guided, but I haven't seen epidurals done in that way. But maybe they're starting to do them. But yeah, she had a epidural on all three of ours, and they didn't use an ultrasound anytime. But a lot of times that can be done now. Just they can actually see where the needle is, which is really helpful. But yeah, so other questions on those? Or? Okay. All right. So yeah, we can just walk through this one together because you guys, well, yeah, I'll let you do it. Actually, go ahead and yeah, send that in. This is a little bit different view of it, right? Yeah, go ahead, label that one more time there. Good refresher for the test on Friday. And you can send in that one on your clickers there. Slightly different view of the same thing we've looked at a few times. All right. Go ahead and send those in. I'll give you a few more seconds here.
I just thought a bit about epidurals, but I've
Yeah.
heard that like if there's like a complication with it, it can like have a potential to make you paralyzed. I've heard that somewhere, but I don't know if it's.
Yeah, I mean, sure, it's always, anytime you stick something in the spinal cord area.
Like how
Yeah.
far would it, is that because they pushed it too far?
Yeah, and
or,
actually
like-
just like slices a bunch of neurons. I mean, that's possible, but that's pretty unlikely. I mean, you can look up the rates of paralysis with epidurals. It's probably, I'm sure it's less than,
Yeah.
1%, but yeah, but it's sure, it's definitely a risk. Yeah.
Just
yeah,
wondering.
Yeah, for sure.
No, sorry.
All right, a couple more of you, go ahead and send it in. Uh-oh, you guys aren't ready for the test on Friday. You better talk to each other and figure this one out. I'm not gonna close it out yet. Change your answer if you need to. You guys did have a good break. That's good. Maybe I'll take it as a good sign. You had a good break. All right, give you about 10 more seconds. Change it if you want to, based on your talk with your teammates. All right, we got a little bit more in one answer. 50% of you are saying E now. Okay. It's a little better. But yeah, let's walk through those here. So we got roots and rami, right? The roots are the parts that are closer to the spinal cord, right? Those are the parts that only have afferent or efferent neurons, right? And then we get out to the rami or the ramus, if we're just talking about one of them. That would be the parts further away from the spinal cord. Those ones are going to be mixed, right? Both afferent and efferent found in those. Okay. So A is what? What do we call that one? Is that dorsal or ventral? Dorsal. Okay. And is that sensory or motor? That's where it gets you guys, huh? Yeah, it's dorsal. So the sad Dave thing, what comes after the D? And Dave? Afferent, there we go. Yeah, so yeah, so that's our dorsal root with afferent neurons. Okay. With this one, we can see the what's that called again? Spinous process. There we go. We can see the spinous process, so we know that's posterior. Okay, we can see the body, so we know that's anterior. We could actually tell what level of the spinal cord this is, not the exact number, but what region, right? By the shape, by the anatomy of that. Which region is this? Cervical. Good, because we got that bifurcated spinous process. we have this transverse foramen, right? And the reason we got that transverse foramen is the same thing we were just talking about before, is those neurons can't just come straight out, right? They've got to go down first, right? So they need holes to go through as they go down. That's what they go through. Okay, so that's that one. And then we go to C, which is the root on the other side. Oh, sorry. Yeah, we'll go to B first, because that's the right order alphabetically, but not really the next one. So dorsal ramus here, right? So this is the one going back to the posterior side, has both sensory and motor. Okay, now we get to the other root, C. This is the ventral root, contains only efferent neurons. Okay, then we go to D. D was the dorsal root ganglion, right? When we were just talking about, contains cell bodies of those afferent neurons. Okay, and then E is our ventral ramus, contains both sensory and motor going to the anterior side of the body. So E is the correct answer for that clicker question there. Okay, glad I didn't just skip over it. Glad you guys had some time to think about it a little bit. Questions on those at all? Give you a sec to finish writing that stuff down. All right, raise your hand if you need another sec before I change slides. Okay, give you another few seconds here. All right, let's go ahead and move on. So we're going to talk a little bit about how the central nervous system, spinal cord, and brain are protected, mostly the spinal cord today. Obviously the cranial bones, right? That's an important piece of that. But then we've got a bunch of other things here too. Okay, so for the brain itself, the skull, for the spinal cord, we have the vertebrae wrapping around it, right? So it's encased in bone, just like the brain is. But then we also have this fat pad that goes around both the anterior and posterior side of the spinal cord. Okay, so that's very protected. That's unique to the spinal cord. And then with both, we have the meninges, which we'll talk about those layers here in a sec. Okay, they both have cerebral spinal fluid, and then they both have a blood-brain barrier. Okay, so that's a cross section of the spinal cord where you can actually see those spinal nerves coming out both directions, right? In each way and straight out this way. And you can see there's quite a bit of space around the spinal cord and the vertebrae also provides some cushion in that way as well. Okay, all right, so yeah, we can see where the spinal nerves exit, right? We got these little intervertebral foramen, right? They're not actually holes in the bones, but they're the spaces between the bones, right? They kind of create these little holes, right? So besides that, everything's completely protected, but when it leaves that little spot, then it's now unprotected as soon as it leaves the vertebrae. One common procedure later on in life when people have chronic back pain, they get a bunch of inflammation built up in this foramen in here. And it kind of pinches the nerves every time they extend their back. And so a common procedure is actually to remove part of the bone right here. And so that's called a laminectomy, right? Remember, there's a lamina in the pedicle, right? So the laminectomy is remove part of that to give that more space, because it's a pretty small little hole that those spinal nerves exit from. And so if you get some extra scar tissue and stuff in there, it gets pinched pretty easily. Okay, and then the meninges. So the meninges, the dura mater is the most exterior one. It's the toughest. Dura mater literally means tough mother in Latin, right? So the toughest part that kind of protects it there. Okay, so we can see that here in the brain, and then we can see it around the spinal cord as well. Okay, typically has two layers, especially in the brain, it has two layers. The outer layer is actually just fused with the skull. So there's the periosteal meningeal layer. That's the dura mater on the outside, right? So we can see this part that's all just kind of fused with the brain, and then there's the inner part that is closer to the skull. Okay, and then we see moving on. Yeah, here's another look at the dura mater and the spinal cord. We can see it out there. Tough layer. We don't have the part that connects right to the vertebrae and the spinal cord because there's this fat pad layer in between instead. So we don't have the part that's right next to the bone like we did in the brain. Okay, then we got the other two layers. The next one down is called the arachnoid mater. Okay, and then from there, the pia mater. Okay, the pia mater is the one that's just right on the neurons themselves on the brain. The arachnoid mater is one up. And in that space between the what's called the subarachnoid space is where there's a lot of fluid. That's where we have some cerebral spinal fluid. And this is where nerves and blood vessels are housed. And so it's common to have what's called, we'll look at the bleed types here in a second, but that space in there is where you have what's called a subarachnoid bleed. And so if we look at different types of intracranial bleeds, most of them are named based on those meninges and where they're located based on the meninges. Okay, so an epidural bleed would be just like we're just talking about, we're outside of the dura mater, right? There's a subdural bleed or subdural hematoma, which would be underneath, right? So now we're between the dura mater and the arachnoid mater. Then there's a subarachnoid bleed, which is in that space I was just showing you. Okay, and then if we get below below the pia mater, then it's just called an intracerebral bleed or a parenchymal bleed, and that will be down here somewhere, actually in the brain tissue. Okay, different types of bleeds can be all different severities. A lot of it has to do with the intensity of bleed, how much of the blood vessels were broken, but a lot of these bleeds can increase intracranial pressure, which is a life-threatening condition that sometimes that pressure needs to be removed in order to save brain tissue. Because if you get too much pressure in there, then the blood flow going up to your brain is overcome by the pressure in the brain, and so we can't get new blood in the brain. And that's one of the biggest problems with these intracranial bleeds, at least from an emergency standpoint. Okay, bless you. Questions on any of these? Okay, and then yeah, so another condition related to the meninges is meningitis, right? So it's called meningitis because it's literally just inflammation of one of these three membranes that we were just talking about. Okay, the meningitis vaccine protects against bacterial meningitis, which can be a very severe one. But there's also viral meningitis too. We don't have a specific vaccine necessarily against those, but that is really just inflammation of that meningeal tissue, and it can damage your whole central nervous system if it gets bad enough, but it also kind of tightens up your whole central nervous system. So one way to one basic test of if somebody's meninges are inflamed is really just to do kind of like a hamstring stretch, like put their leg out like this, bring their toes up to their head, and then put their head down. Even when you do that to yourself, if you have tight hamstrings, you'll feel it. But when you do that and you get excruciating pain kind of down the back and down the back of your leg, then you're actually just stretching out your meninges when you do that, and they get tighter and more painful when you have meningitis, obviously. So that's, don't think you have meningitis every time. That hurts when you do that, but it's just kind of showing how interconnected the whole nervous system is. Yeah, all the way down from your nerves going down your feet up to your head. Okay, and then another key thing that helps protect our central nervous system is our cerebral spinal fluid. Okay, we talked about before how those ependymal cells are important for secreting the cerebral spinal fluid, and those are found lining the big cavities in our brains. Okay, the choroid plexes are those cavities. Anytime we have a plexus in our brain, that's a cavity. This is a common thing that's looked for on like a anatomy ultrasound of a fetus. A developing fetus you should be able to see different. You should be able to see the ventricles in the brain and those plexes in the brain, and so should see normal production of cerebral spinal fluid. Okay, so it's very similar to the plasma in our blood. Okay, there's two parts of our blood. There's the red blood cells, and then there's the plasma. For the most part, the plasma is just like the water part that has a bunch of dissolved stuff in it. Okay, it doesn't have quite as many proteins. We only have about 150 mils of cerebral spinal fluid on average in adults. Okay, but we make about 500 mils of it per day. Okay, so we're constantly replenishing this stuff is pretty much the bottom line with that. It's replaced about every 8 hours, about 3 times a day. We completely replace our cerebral spinal fluid. Okay, and so we're making a lot of it all the time. And yeah, so this is because this is how our brain gets nutrients, right? And so if it doesn't get replaced, then our brain isn't getting proper nutrients because we don't have that direct contact with blood in the brain because of that blood-brain barrier. Okay, so other parts of it besides providing nutrients, other purposes, it provides shock absorption, right, to the spinal cord and the brain, but primarily the brain. The brain is literally like floating in this fluid. Okay, and that effectively reduces the weight of the brain that is like resting on anything by about 97%, right? So the brain just kind of floating in the cerebral spinal fluid. And so anytime you get a blow to the head or something, or you have to stop quickly, your brain first has to push through that cerebral spinal fluid before it hits your skull. And that takes a lot of the shock away from your brain and helps protect it quite a bit. Okay, so here's kind of a view of the brain that shows those ventricles, those cavities where we have most of the cerebral spinal fluid. You can see these large ventricles in different spots, and then we can see the cerebral spinal fluid goes down that hole down the center of the spinal cord too, which is that central canal. We have cerebral spinal fluid filling that space as well. Okay, and then one condition that is related to our cerebral spinal fluid is called hydrocephalus, which really just means like water on the brain. Okay. Hydrocephalus is just an excessive amount of cerebral spinal fluid, CSF. Okay. There's lots of different causes. You don't need to know all those. The most common cause though here is just sometimes a blockage or just a complete narrowing of this aqueduct that allows the fluid to circulate. And so it needs to be able to circulate through all those different regions to be able to be soaked up and replenished. And so if it kind of gets stuck in one spot, then we just keep making more and more and more, and it just keeps filling and filling and filling. So if this happens in a kid whose growth plates haven't closed yet in the cranial bones, then the head itself gets bigger, right? And you can actually see the space between the frontal bones and the parietal bones there in that kid, right? It's actually just separated the skull bones because it's just ligaments that are holding those together in a kid. You can see that fontanelle, right? That little soft spot, but it's just completely indented because it's all lifted up like that. If this happens in an adult, which it can happen in adults, then it can create that intracranial pressure that can severely damage the brain. So it's a little bit more dangerous in adults. Either way, the root cause of it needs to get figured out and stopped for sure, but you can remove some of the fluid in the meantime to take some of the pressure off. Okay, questions about that at all? Okay, and then lastly, again, we talked about those astrocytes being responsible for creating our blood-brain barrier. The little feet of the astrocytes come out and wrap around capillaries, okay? And those capillaries are where the blood is. So this is our barrier between the blood and the brain. Okay, we're done a little bit early, so I'm going to have us do one thing here. I'm going to have you guys complete the course evaluation for this course. Okay, so have you guys gotten emails from Campus Labs about that yet? Yeah. Okay, so just pull that out. Click on the link there. I do value your feedback about all aspects of the course. So please, please give me your feedback, write in comments, ideas you have, suggestions. I'm always open to that and interested in that. So yeah, I would definitely appreciate your feedback on the course. So hop in there. You can do it with your phone. You can do it with a device or with a laptop or tablet. Yeah, appreciate you doing that. And I will see you guys on Wednesday. Whenever you're done with that, you can take off. If you're not sure where the link is, just search for Campus Labs in your email. It should pop up there.